Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leigh Glazer. I'm the director of the Lunder Institute for American Art at Colby College. Whistler, born in 1834, learned watercolor technique as a boy, and he occasionally used it for preparatory studies in his early career. But despite the tremendous popularity of watercolor in Britain, and Whistler's desire for success within the English art world, he never seriously embraced the medium of watercolor until the 1880s. This was a period when he needed urgently to reinvent his career after falling out with patron Frederick Leyland over the Peacock Room in 1877 and a financially ruinous lawsuit with the eminent critic John Ruskin the following year. In the wake of that, Whistler rediscovered watercolor during a sojourn in Venice between 1879 and 1880, and upon his return to London, created over the next decade a prodigious number of seemingly effortless watercolors depicting all manner of subjects. He called them, seemingly dismissively, little games, but they were invested with tremendous ambition for both financial success and an enduring art historical legacy. Displayed in a series of carefully orchestrated solo exhibitions in London and New York between 1884 and 1889, the watercolors, beautiful pictures that were portable and dainty, as the artist described them. The watercolors were intended to expand Whistler's market reach to include rich Americans shopping for art in Europe, and they were also a demonstration for Whistler, a demonstration of certain deeply held avant-garde aesthetic principles regarding finish, labor, and verisimilitude that he had first articulated in his controversial oil nocturnes of the decade prior. Today's program will illuminate how Whistler's technique relates to those aesthetic aspirations and goals. Now, watercolor is notorious among artists for being a difficult medium to master. What makes watercolor so challenging, and what are the secrets to painting with it? How did Whistler plumb those secrets, and where does his approach fit into the larger history of watercolor in America and Britain? Today, master watercolorist Peter Ulrich and fellow artist and art historian Leigh Culver will explore these questions through a combination of lecture, demonstration, and commentary. Leigh Culver is an art historian, teacher, and painter. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Studio Art from Smith College, an MA in Art History from Williams College, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where we were actually colleagues and students together many years ago. She's a specialist in American art of the Gilded Age and taught at the University of Notre Dame's Washington Semester Program for over a decade. Leigh returned to her studio roots in 2006 and has won multiple watercolor awards in the Mid-Atlantic region. She recently served as president of the Potomac Valley Watercolorists and currently teaches advanced watercolor at the Art League School in Alexandria, Virginia. She'll be joined on stage by Peter Ulrich, an award-winning painter working in watercolor, oil, and acrylic. He's on the faculty of the Art League School in Alexandria and the Harmony Hall Regional Center in Fort Washington, Maryland. Peter exhibits widely in juried shows and galleries, including being twice selected for the National Watercolor Society's annual international exhibit. His work has won many awards and was featured in the 18th edition of Splash, a book series showcasing outstanding watercolor artists. Peter is a signature member of the National Watercolor Society, the Baltimore Watercolor Society, and the Potomac Valley Watercolorists, and he conducts workshops throughout the Mid-Atlantic region in the Cotswolds and in southern France. Now today, Leigh is going to set the stage by giving a brief overview of Whistler's place in the history of watercolor, and Peter will join her for a live painting demo that'll be projected on the screen with color commentary by Leigh, followed by a Q&A with the audience. So please give them both a warm welcome.
Thank you, Leigh. I'm going to start off by giving you a sense of Whistler's best-known works before he turns to watercolor in the 1880s. And then from there, we'll do some close looking at his watercolors and the materials and techniques before I turn over the stage to Peter. Whistler declared this painting on the left a masterpiece, presumably before anyone else could. He had just recently moved to London, and he was interested in making a huge success in the art market in London. And he is answering the call that Baudelaire gave to artists of painting everyday scenes of modern life, not the stories of myths and history. So he paints this painting entirely in plein air at the Angel Inn that you can still see today, visit today, looking over the dockyards of this thoroughfare of commerce and trade in the center of London along the River Thames. And he's telling us with this image, I can paint figures. I can paint all sorts of vessels with all sorts of complicated ropes and pulleys. I can paint sky, I can paint great distances. I can do this incredible composition that locks in these figures. And just imagine this painting without this streak of blue here that complements the oranges throughout there and enlivens the whole surface of the canvas. The following year, he uses his same model, the red-haired mistress, Whistler's mistress, Joanna Heffernan, in this portrait that caused a sensation. It was considered completely radical at the time. People initially thought, is this an illustration for some novel? What is she doing? What's the story? And Whistler insisted this is not about storytelling, this is not about art narrative, this is about art for art's sake. Meaning this is about color and color harmonies on the surface. And later on, he has the title Symphony in White to call attention to the fact that this is really a painting where you're meant to look at white on white and how it shifts and changes in the surface. The next year, he does another painting called Symphony in White, and a newspaper critic sort of scoffs and says, Symphony in White, but I see brown, I see blue, I see yellows, I see all sorts of colors. And Whistler, with his typical barbed wit, responds, do you mean to tell me symphony in F would be the F note played over and over again and again? Fool. So he takes to naming his paintings arrangements, harmonies, nocturnes, to emphasize again this art for art's sake. So even this iconic painting of Whistler's Mother that we all know was not called Whistler's Mother. It's arrangement in gray and black, emphasizing the harmonies of those colors. Notice the asymmetrical composition, the cropping here, the way in which there's this compression of space so that the floor seems to be on the same plane as the wall. These are all reflective of the influence of Japanese woodblock prints. And at the same time that he's painting Whistler's Mother, he's doing a series of nocturnes like this one. And I bring in a Japanese woodblock print to give you a sense of that influence. That he collected these prints, he looked at them, and he was tried to pick up some of their pictorial conventions, i.e. asymmetric composition, abstractions, compression of space. Here he paints with these very watered down, diluted oils that one person said look almost as thin as watercolors, where you can actually see the weave of the canvas showing through. A very different image than the image I first showed you of the River Thames. This is at twilight and at dusk, and he talked about this, typically this River Thames is dirty and filthy and vaguely dangerous, but he found the poetry in it at twilight and at dusk, where he talks about the riverside mists sort of looking like veils, and the warehouses seeming like palaces at night, and the whole city hanging in the heavens. So he's trying to give us that essence in these kind of images. Some people love them. So there's one woman that wrote to him and said, I was walking along the River Thames, and it was looking just like your nocturne. And he writes back and says, so nature's catching up. And he saw nature as a keyboard, right, with all the notes. If you hit all the notes, it's going to be noise. He said it takes the artist to choose the keys that you're going to play to create harmonies, nocturnes, symphonies. when he paints this nocturne of a nightly firework display at the Cremorne Gardens. This is too much for John Ruskin. John Ruskin, the pre-Raphaelite painter, I bring in an earlier watercolor that he did that shows Ruskin's proclivity for minute observation of nature, something Whistler might say is every note of the piano, perhaps. Ruskin, on the other hand, who is also the foremost Victorian art critic, writes in this obscure journal that what is the world coming to that you're charging 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public space? And Whistler, who never shies from publicity, decides to sue Ruskin for libel. And there's a media circus on both sides of the Atlantic. Everybody's reading about it in the newspapers. And one of the crucial questions is, well, how much is this really worth? How do we decide that this is worth 200 guineas? Is it the labor that goes into it, the work? Well, how much time did this take you, Whistler? Because it doesn't look like it may have taken very long. And he answers, the experience of a lifetime. And with that, he wins the court case, but he only wins a farthing, which is half a penny. So he ends up having to declare bankruptcy in order to pay the lawyers. And following that, so this is 1879, he finds himself in the position of needing to reinvent himself, both artistically and financially. And so he luckily gets a commission to do some etchings in Venice. He goes to Venice for more than a year, and he does a number of works in paper, not just etchings like these, but also pastels and watercolors. All these works on paper that Baudelaire had called, these are the quintessential media of modernity, right? And 2 points here. One, he is not just using one media at one time. He's working in all these media, and they inform each other. There's crossovers. So the mark making that he does on the etching plate easily translates into the calligraphic mark making in his watercolors. Second point, he is experimenting with papers. He is an experimenter. He's constantly trying out different papers. Unlike an artist like Sargent, who likes one kind of paper and does the rough paper over and over again, he's trying everything out. And so at the time, he tries out non-watercolor paper, but there's 3 types of watercolor paper that still exist today: rough, cold, and hot. And you can imagine rough is the rough surface, has the roughest surface, hills and valleys. Hot press, completely smooth, and cold in between. And so one of the decisions that we make as artists when we sit down and start to do a watercolor is, what kind of paper are we going to use? And Whistler chooses based on what he's interested in doing. So if he wants to create this agitated ocean or agitated sky that you see here, he's choosing rough. And I'm bringing in 4 details. These are details of paintings that he's used with rough and actually with cold press, because rough and cold can do the same thing that hot press cannot do. So these are 2 examples of details of hot press. On rough and on cold, you can get this sparkling effect of these white holidays with a dry brush that can skip across the surface of the canvas, and the paint picks up on the hills, but not on the valleys. So you see how he's able to get a glint of sunlight on the city of Venice, in the sky, the glint on the water, with this dry brush that you simply cannot do with hot press, no matter how much you try. So if you're skimming along and you want to leave whites, you just have to leave whites by not painting them at all. But hot press is great for other effects. And so he uses hot press paper here with this ocean wave. It's great if you want to play with the watery irregularities of paint itself. And so you can see this incredible sky that twins as both a depiction of these vaporous clouds that are shifting and moving, and seems to be simply a play of paint and pigment on the surface of the page. And so droplets, you can see this big drop that splatted right here, and the fingers that moved out into the wet pigment underneath. And Ruskin might have wanted to clean that up a little bit, but he's letting it be. It almost becomes a focal point of this composition. And you see water stains coming in here. And really, as a watercolor, in the watercolor medium, one of the distinctive things is that you have this extra component of water. And it's not just about wet on wet or wet on dry. It's about how wet, how dry. When are you going to put that stroke on what kind of surface paper? And you're constantly juggling your pigment to water ratio and putting it on the surface and deciding, seeing what happens. And one of the amazing things about watercolor, the magic of watercolor, if you will, is that when you lay down a stroke, it doesn't always just stay there. It moves. The pigment is suspended in the water, and depending on the surface in the water, it shifts and changes, and then you as an artist are deciding, oh, do I intervene now? Do I stop and let it be? Do I shift? Do I blot? What do I do? And some watercolorists talk about this feeling of doing a painting as being a conversation with the paper itself, that you're not the only creator here. It's the paper that you've chosen that is responding in conversation. Watercolor manuals at Whistler's time also talked about hot press as being ideal for minute details of figure work. And so you see, and this is sort of unfair because this is absolutely huge for you now, but it's actually this small. But you can see what you would see, minutely painted, that he's able to get these individual little apples, each with their own little shadows and highlights. And notice this bonnet and this drip of, ribbon in the back that seems to have been painted by a drip itself. I mean, this is one of the wonderful effects that we love to get on paint. Because the surface of there's no tooth. You have a sense, you can see it thinned out here, gathering here, so it seems to almost be organically made. The other wonderful thing about Whistler's watercolors is the way he leaves his whites. So this is the white of the paper here, the blouse. Notice that the way he has defined the shoulder here, he's done that with the negative shape of the architecture in the background, but he has no need to define the other side of the shoulder. If he did so, it might look too cut out. He leaves a lot for our imagination. When you see a watercolor like Morby Hall, you almost don't know, I didn't notice it first, but look at this huge, undescribed blob that takes up a large proportion of the canvas, of the paper. And yet he's giving us just enough information to have it do what it needs to do for him in this painting. He's given us a shadow shape so that we know this is a big piece of furniture sitting on the floor. It's large, it gives a sense of that room space as grand. And by contrast, it brings our eye here in a way that we wouldn't go necessarily if this had been so much more carefully described. You can go to Morby Hall today and go through these grand rooms, or you can go online and see them in video, and you can pick out, the room that he painted in, because he has so acutely observed the proportions of the fireplace, the bric-a-brac over it, the proportions of the wood panel. If you look at a detail here, one of the things that we as artists focus on with watercolor is hard edges and soft edges, right? So if you do a painting that's all hard edges, like here and here, you're going to have a painting that looks very cut out. There's no air, there's no atmosphere. If you do all soft edges, everything's going to be a blur, right? So the juggle is, to balance hard and soft edges and when you're going to do what. And so, for instance, in this painting here, he's got this fabulous frisson of edge of two wet strokes next to each other that has been softened by he's come back with it looks like a stroke of water to soften this edge. And then this edge here has been made hard by two strokes that have been put together, but you've got to leave a little valley of white, as you all know, or else this will happen. One will bleed into the next. And it does so here, and he's not cleaning that up, right? Other people might do that, but this becomes a code for rapid execution, spontaneity, right? Sketch. And so throughout this image, he's coding that I'm rapidly executing this image. And yet, when you look and you start to see the details of what he's doing, the hard and soft edges, what he comes back in and defines over and over again. You see this fabulous collection of plates here where he defines the rim shape of this plate with blue, but then here it's a white plate where the same blue is the shadow shape of the dish. So he's really carefully observing, he's really juggling his water to pigment ratios, and when to go back in. This is not something where you just sit down and oh, it's fun. It's concentrated work to make it look, and yet he's coating, it's effortless, right? Even when he does very simple compositions. This is the first watercolor that Charles Freer purchased of Whistler's. And it seems, at first glance, monochromatic, like his other nocturnes, very simplified. And the closer you look, though, you see in this area the variations of value tones. It's not just 2 values or 3 values, but maybe 4 or 5 here. And these shifts in color, where this barge here is redder than this bluer gray, and then you've got this fabulous shot of color that he's added here that hasn't fully evaporated into the others, but is sort of left to make this whole sort of gray sing. He's really carefully observed these different boats. He's not just giving you a sense of boats, but he says, look at this. Here, this is a barge. This is a steamship. This is a sail. This is a sail that's whipped by wind, and you have that sense of atmosphere and wind. And this sky that he uses, Chinese white with the sky, which we'll talk a little bit with Peter there, the more you look at his skies, the more you see these subtleties of tonalities. Some look warmer, some look pinker, silver, etc. So he's really, his watercolors really reward close looking. So in conclusion, when we understand Whistler's intentions, his art for art's sake intentions, when we look closely at his images and understand the process that he makes them, the materials and techniques, we really get an understanding of one of his axioms, which was, it does take work, but you don't want it to look like it takes work or labor. And it takes a lot of work to do that. It takes work to make it seem effortless in its work. And so his watercolors show Whistler the experimenter, Whistler, what one person said, the private studio Whistler, who is earnest, tireless, somber, working, and yet coding for us his aesthetic value of being effortless. Thank you. So I want to introduce Peter, and Leigh was wonderful at talking about his art background. I like to say, now that you may think that watercolor is rocket science, we've brought a rocket scientist here to show you how to do watercolor. He actually has 2 degrees in physics from Yale and MIT, and the last 10 years of his career, he was at NASA working on the mission to Mars and the Cassini mission to Saturn, among other projects. So we really do have a rocket scientist here who's going to show us how it's done. Make it all look easy, effortless.
My demonstration today will be guided by the characteristics of the watercolors that you saw in the gallery upstairs by Whistler. In particular, I'm going to concentrate on the so-called seaside paintings that he did in Cornwall and in Southend. Those characteristics are as follows. They're small paintings, 5 by 7, 8 by 10. Over there on the floor of the stage are 2 copies I made this summer of Whistler watercolors. They're also in the gallery upstairs. The originals are upstairs. And you can see they're very small. One of those is 8 by 10, the other's 5 by 7. So they're small paintings. By the early 1880s, he was no longer sketching ahead of time with pencil, so I'll be doing that today. Although he had a broad palette available to him, and you can see here I've got a subset of the paints that he used. Typically in his paintings, he limited himself to a few selected paints from his palette. Probably the most characteristic thing of his paintings that we've noted is the use of Chinese white, which is a semi-opaque white paint, zinc oxide, I think, made in very, very small pumice particles that are then suspended in the gum arabic to make the watercolor. And so I'll be using Chinese white in various ways today. He painted on a 140-pound wove paper, different style of paper, including the hot press, cold press, and rough paper that Leigh talked about. And my demo here will be on hot press, 140-pound Arches paper. These paintings were typically done very quickly, although the conservators point out that there's a lot of reworking in some of the paintings. However, because of the time constraint today, I'll do the quick version. He simplified the treatment of subject matter, and that'll be my intent today, too, to simplify things in the way he did. He painted en plein air, that is out of doors. Unfortunately, I can't do that for you today. I'm doing it here, but I'm going to do the next best thing. I'm going to paint from a photograph that you see up there that I took in England on the south coast of Devonshire, on the English Channel. And it's a scene that not only is similar to the paintings you see in the gallery upstairs, but also it might be an area that Whistler actually did some painting. And then finally, when I'm done my demonstration, I'm going to frame it with a frame similar to the ones on the floor over there, which for those of us who have been doing watercolor for many years is really quite a striking way to present the paintings, to put them in frames that had heretofore and subsequently been used only for oil paintings or acrylic paintings on canvas, whereas watercolor typically is framed with a white or off-color matte and a very thin frame. Whistler chose to frame them, as you see them framed there, and the use of Chinese white opaque paint gave them a flavor of a more substantive opaque medium like oil paintings. So, without further ado, I will begin here. First of all, I'll put on an apron. There are a lot of Potomac Valley watercolorists in the audience. So, now what I want you to do is to go on an imaginary journey with me. Imagine that it is 140 years ago, and it's Victorian England, and therefore, in Victorian England, we didn't use these things. And therefore, no painter would be caught dead outdoors without his boater on. So, well, to do the watercolor, you need water. So, we'll begin with that. All right? I'm going to do a series of so-called washes. I hope you can see that. I'm mixing cerulean blue and, of course, the ever-present Chinese white that Whistler used. Here I'm doing what is known as an underpainting. Underpainting is exactly what it says. It's the first layers that go down. I'm going to have to move that out of the way.
And with the hot press, you're more likely to see the individual strokes of this sky than you would be on cold rough that would give a more smoothly gradiated wash. And Whistler, of course, when he's doing these skies, you see he's drawing these skies, less of a smooth wash and much more of a drawn sky.
So I've underpainted the sky. In this particular photo, there isn't much structure in the sky, but we might want to add some additional interest in the sky with, for example, with, if there were clouds in the sky. So I'm underpainting the beach area. This is raw sienna. By the way, this palette I'm using is made up of colors that Whistler used. And some of them are brand new to me. I don't have in my standard palette, I don't have vermilion and carmine and Davies gray and lamp black and Chinese white, for example.
And see here, you're already getting a little blooming, perhaps. You can see the differentiation of water to pigment ratios in his beach, and that's what hot press is great at. It's great at you really can see the stroke of the artist's hands sort of saved on the surface. Okay.
So what I've done essentially is eliminated the white paper. So now I can make value and color judgments without large areas of the white paper kind of interfering. So I'm going to dry that. Whistler didn't have the advantage of hairdryer. So at this point, he would probably go off and have a cigarette.
Can you guys hear me? No? So you can see these little areas that have missed the paint, and he's just letting it be to give it this sort of fresh look. He doesn't need to go back in and scrub and make everything all clean and perfect with this.
So there's the far hill. Now
and is that with, what did you do to make that far hill?
That's the cerulean mixture with a little bit of the raw sienna in it. And now I'm going to paint this hillside using this Viridian and a little bit of the lamp back to knock it back a bit.
You can really see how the pigment's suspended in the water and how it continues to move and shift. Hopefully you can see that as you're... And I think you'll start to see with this little drip on the right that the pigment's slowly sort of scooching down that line. Do you see that? You might watch that, might continue to do so.
So this nearer cliff is, looks like it's devoid of vegetation. I think it's sandstone. These cliffs in Devon are similar to the Dover cliffs, but the Dover cliffs are chalk. That makes them white. And these are sandstone, and that's why they're burnt sienna.
And on the page up here, it's much browner than, this is much better on there.
Yeah, that's really a rich representation.
The colors are not quite as strong on the paper.
And now we'll this is ultramarine blue. By the time he was doing these seascapes, seaside paintings, he had stopped using cobalt blue. So in the interest of being authentic today, I'm going to use ultramarine, like so.
You can see how it's not absorbed so quickly, so he really has time to play around with the strokes that he's putting on. As the paint is drying in his beach scene, you can see the marks of his brush even more pronounced. So if you were doing it in cold press, they would all sort of be absorbed into each other. So a lot of people find hot press very difficult to work with because it really shows every mark that you're making in a way. Very difficult to work with hot press because it shows every mark that you're making. And some people love that, love seeing those sort of irregularities of marks and pigments. And some choose other papers.
Okay, while this is still wet, we can add a little bit of detail here. Okay, now one of the things that makes a Whistler watercolor a Whistler is his very simple treatment of people.
So you're testing that that's dry enough.
Yeah. So it's a lot of what he does is just little gestures. And the immediate addition of people gives you a scale. Suddenly we put a small figure in, and then the scale of these cliffs becomes evident.
It's wonderful because they function in several ways, right, in terms of scale, but also, to my mind, the mark making on the surface of the canvas also, to me, calls attention to the surface at the same time as a two-dimensional surface.
Just little specks of color.
And Whistler, too. I mean, Peter's painting little figures with sort of a sense of contemporary dress, and Whistler did as well. If you see his little figures, they're in fashionable dresses and, black coats. So he, too, was painting the contemporary, a sense of contemporary people at that time. They're black in his paintings because that's what they were wearing. When they weren't, he's got these pink dresses and yellow dresses.
This might be a good place over here to put the butterfly, right? Now, typically, as you learned in the lecture in the gallery, he wasn't. He was being driven more by the Japanese woodcut kind of flat approach, so he would probably not do anything with this foreground. However, I think that I personally like to put some detail in the foreground to give the painting depth. And because it is in the foreground, it's closer to us, we can see a small detail. And so what I do typically is some spattering of paint.
Actually flinging the paint.
I'm going to fling it the way
Russ can accuse Whistler of, and yet Whistler really didn't do. But we now do it as watercolorists. And again, it serves the purpose of calling attention to the materiality of the paint on the two-dimensional surface, as well as suggesting surface foreground texture. But this is not something that Whistler would have typically done. Yeah.
Question?
Is asking about brush choices. Leigh, do you want to? Yeah, we don't really know a lot. I think he did a number of different types of brushes. You can see with his paintings that sometimes he's using, they're larger strokes, very minute strokes. Peter, you're in the way, actually, of the camera. They were seeing the top of your head.
Oh.
That's what.
I'm sorry if the glare from the top of my head got in your...
So you can tell he used a wide variety of strokes. And back in Whistler's day, actually, brushes were called pencils. So there's a sense, with the, they had points. I can't remember. It was later on that flat brushes for watercolor were used. And so the sense that the brush was a drawing implement, and certainly with all of Whistler's watercolor, you have a sense that he's drawing the scene. Does that make sense?
What I'm doing here is taking the Chinese white directly from the tube and applying it as if it were oil paint. And what we achieve there is the ability to cover. If you add water to the Chinese white, it becomes semi-opaque and it doesn't cover the way it will this way.
So something interesting about Chinese white, because nowadays I was always taught, you don't want to use opaque pigment, that's cheating. You're covering up, you want to use the white of the paper. But actually, Chinese white was invented, Winsor Newton innovated and patented Chinese white in the 1830s, and it became this revolutionary fad to use Chinese white in everything, and all of the artists of the 19th century used Chinese white extensively, as far as I can tell. Sargent used it. And what's interesting, though, is that you still have a sense of transparency. But they would mix it in order to get some paler colors. And Ruskin, in particular, talked about in his books that you don't have to use as much water to do paler colors. Usually you'd have to use a lot of water to a little pigment to get soft colors. Well, if you use Chinese white and mix those for your soft colors, your paper stays more dry. So there were a lot of discussions about the use of Chinese white in the 19th century, and he's part of his era in using Chinese white extensively in all of his watercolors. And we've kind of the watercolorists that I know and teachers and societies, that's not something that is typical.
Okay, the question is, am I done? And the
Yes.
answer should
When are
always
you
be
finished?
yes.
What I love is that, watercolors, as they dry, they fade a little bit. So you typically have to put it on more strongly because once they're dry, they're a lot weaker. And so his mountains have really faded into this mist of the sky behind it. Less so than you see here, but I think we need to
So let's see how it looks.
So Peter's ready to begin a second and this time on cold press?
Cold press. This paper is slightly more rough than the hot press, so we can get some effects there that we couldn't get in hot press. So let me just proceed again with initial washes. Put a little bit of Mr. Whistler's Chinese white into the sky. You can see the roughness of the paper already.
And this has Chinese white already mixed in.
Okay, and then down here.
See that white holiday sparkle that you have with the cold press paper and with the hot press paper?
I want to retain some of that glitter
Magic.
in the water.
Look at how that conveys a sense of light.
And then look at my chart. this beach is interesting. What's happened here, this is, by the way, the river Exe, E-X, in the south of England. And this is the Exe estuary, which means that it connects to the channel and is susceptible to tides. So strong tides come in, lift these boats. 4 hours later, the tide reverses and goes out, and the boats drop down into this sandy area. And that's what's happened here. This is low tide at the River Exe.
And you're waiting to sort of go back in to have these dry and settle a little bit.
So what I would like to do here is something called negative painting. I'm going to paint around this boat shape.
You saw Whistler do that with a woman's blouse.
And then I've got to quickly connect that so it doesn't look painted around.
Knowing when to do that comes from complete experience of when to connect strokes so that they're not too wet, not too dry, as he just did around the boat.
And then we'll put some warm paint in the foreground. Okay. I think that sky is probably dry enough that I can put these far hills in.
So you're never necessarily painting where you want to be painting. You're constantly painting depending on, okay, is that stroke dry? Is that stroke dry? Is that ready to be painted on? Is this? So there's a lot, a lot of people think, oh, this looks like fun to just do it. There's a lot going on in your head as far as what's dry, what's wet, when can I do what?
And there's one little...
Peter, your head.
Yep, Peter, your head's...
Sorry. There's one little collection of buildings here on the far shore that I want to save some white paper for. Okay? So
It's got that nice white channel between those two strokes.
I'll dry this.
The sky, you can't, when you see it in person, you'll see that sky has really taken on a very milky quality that's really distinctive to mixing with Chinese white compared to if you're using the white of the paper. You have this lovely sort of cloudy, milky kind of surface that you'll see in person when you see his images. And of course, when Whistler is painting, he's mixing his palette, the colors of his palette, and in all of the colors that he does. So in his greens, he'll have the same colors that he has in the foreground, same colors that he has in the sky, to create chromatic unity, right? And a lot of us do that, where we, have this harmonious composition because the colors in our palette are used no matter where they are. The greens are in the foreground, the reds are in other areas.
Now, there's some buildings over on the far shore there, so I'm sorry.
Should we move?
Put some texture into the trees. Okay. Now let's put some form to this boat. It's hard to stay out of
Something I can do, maybe?
stay out of the camera.
I'll stay put.
Maybe I can paint from this angle.
And so are you using, if you see his palette, I don't know if you can see it from under, can you show him actually this? That he's really mixing all of these colors in all of these different puddles, and they're all mixing together so that, again, to create a kind of unifying harmony in the whole.
Watch out for that guy. Just a hint of orange there. And there.
You see with a lot of Whistler's works that sometimes he'll just have, one ding of strong color amidst these sort of disembodied sort of spirits of color that really enliven one area of the image.
And for this boat out in the far shore, I think I'll just go with body color. The British call these opaque paints body color because they give the subject body. And while I've got it out, let me just add some interest out here.
You have to see the real object.
Not producing well. All right, here's another boat here. And a boat, whoops. Sorry about that. And rocks and stuff in the foreground. We put some rigging on the sailboat. clockwise here. Now this sand is wet, so there's going to be reflections in the sand. I do that by wetting the paper and dragging color down. And there's reflections here, and undoubtedly there as well.
So you can see he's, softened up that edge when we were talking about hard and soft edges, how you can go back with water, just with pure water, and bring down the pigment with the reflections. And notice the calligraphy and the trees in the background are really varied now in value as it dries.
Okay. These rocks are a little bit too insistent for my taste, so we'll blot those. Maybe that boat too. Not make it too important. And we can play the spattering game again.
A final fling.
Probably don't want to spatter more than that. You got a couple unwanted birds flying here, so let's get rid of those.
So you can see how this, you can really lift pigment from the surface of the canvas, of the paper. And some papers it's easier to do that with than others. And look at those, just those few strokes of wet on wet gives a sense of the mirrored surface of the water that he's adding at this point and not earlier. So he knows when to put his strokes at what point.
Okay, I think.
And this, I love this stroke that went off the foreground of the top-masted ship that brings in so many of the colors that he's using elsewhere into the sand. We see that in at least one of Whistler's Venice pictures, I think, where he has this dry brush little bird through these milky clouds of sky.
Okay.
So when you're talking slapdash, you realize slapdash is not slapdash, right? It's work. It takes time to look like it's fresh and unfussy. he's not going back and, he keeps his strokes fresh. Doesn't go back into them and rework them and fuss with them with the brush. And that's a real challenge.
Am I done?
So if this looks easy to do, this took the experience of his lifetime. So thank you.
Push it up, push it up.
There you go.
So I think we do have time for some questions from the audience, and Ari is going to be running around with the microphone, so if you could wait for that to come to you, since this is being recorded.
That's right. And we'll put the watercolors up at the front of the stage. I hope you all have a chance to come look at them when we're getting up. But let's just take a couple questions first and see where we go.
Could you tell us what brush you're using, please?
Yeah, these are called silver black velvet brushes. They're a pseudo sable brush. They have all the characteristics of a real sable brush at about 1/10 the cost. And they've been my favorite now for a couple years.
Peter, it looks like you have your paper on a panel. Did you glue the paper to like gator board or something?
I knew I was going to stick them in frames, so I cut a backing board to 9x12 and put the 9x12 paper. Both of these papers were in blocks, the kind of blocks that Whistler used, glued around the edges. So I removed them from the blocks ahead of time and glued them to the boards so I could stick it in there. But it's an Arch 140-pound cold press and hot press paper.
This is a question I think that's asked perhaps frequently, but how do you know when to stop? How do you know when you
How do you know
haven't
when to stop?
overworked the-
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically, we stick with it too long, and then it gets overworked and loses its spontaneity and its freshness. So what I tell my students is do your painting up to about the 80% point, then quit. And then come back a week later and see if it really needs any further attention. And typically it doesn't. So yeah, overworking can be a real problem for any artist, especially for watercolorists. Watercolor is so unforgiving. After you put down dark values, you can't really get light values over them, over the dark areas, whereas with oils or acrylics, you can go back many times and recreate in the same spot. But with watercolor, you can't do that.
One more question right here.
Are modern watercolors less prone to fade?
Today, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's the question.
Are modern watercolors less prone to fading? There's only maybe one or two pigments that we know of that are prone to fading, like alizarin crimson, but now manufacturers have done a permanent alizarin crimson. So photographs fade too, but pigments really aren't fading the way they did at all.
But at the same time, one of the things we can't do anything about is the light sensitivity of the paper. So just speaking from kind of a museum and conservation standpoint, it's light damage to paper over time from exposure is something that curators and conservators think about as much as the fading of the pigments themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions? Mike.
When one sees the watercolors of Singer Sargent, you could tell pretty much that he was an oil painter before he was a watercolorist. Mm-hmm. And I'm sort of wondering about Whistler and what your sense is of, does he paint like a watercolorist or does he paint like an oil painter?
So that's a really good point. And he certainly, he painted in, watercolor was his first, his mother gave him a little watercolor set like so many people did in their childhood. But he really came to watercolor knowing oil paint. So like Winslow Homer, like John Singer Sargent, he's painting in a lot of media. Whereas by comparison, John Marin in the 20th century, most of his work is all in watercolor. So watercolor paintings that are done by artists who are steeped in other media, you see that influence absolutely in their watercolors, which I think is what your point is. And absolutely with Whistler too. Like his experience with etchings inform his watercolors. His experience in pastels inform his watercolors, and his watercolors inform his etchings. And the oils that he did, he was diluting his oil paints already to such a degree that some people said his oil paints look like watercolor. He wasn't doing watercolor, but it was a natural medium for him to pick up because he was already painting so thinly. He was doing these washes in his on the etching plates. He was doing this calligraphic mark making on his etchings. And so the techniques that he was using in other media completely informed how he approached watercolor. Does that make sense?
Also, the addition of the Chinese white makes these passages here almost oil painting-like.
Yes.
And then the fact that he framed them in these plein air gold leaf wide frames without a mat enhanced that impression that you're looking at something other than a pure watercolor.
In Whistler's time with the general public, was watercolor as popular with the general public as oil painting, or was it becoming more popular, or how did that work out?
So in the 1870s was kind of the height of this huge boom in popularity in the market, exhibiting and selling of watercolors both in America and in England. So at the time Whistler decides to do watercolors, there's two big watercolor societies in London. They're exhibiting, they're selling, they've opened up a place in Piccadilly Square, and when he decides to go into watercolor, part of the reason is that he's aware of the market for these things, its popularity, the exhibits that are happening. He's not, however, interested at all in getting involved with watercolor societies because he sees what they're doing is completely different than what he's doing. There's some paintings from the watercolor societies that are 30 by 50, so more than 2 full sheets size, huge. And they're very detailed. And so he's doing something else, and he's really coming more from the French avant-garde. Degas invited him to exhibit with the Impressionists. He's interested in elevating the sketch and the sense of immediacy and spontaneity and rapid execution, elevating that as a finished work. So that's where he's coming from, is more the sketch-like quality of the Impressionists. But he's very aware and very smart about the absolute popularity of watercolor and how many opportunities there are to sell watercolor. This is during the 1870s. So in 1879, when he decides, okay, I'm going to focus on watercolor, that's where he's going in. Now, I think there's a fading of, it's hit the peak, and you talk about this in your catalog.
Yeah, it became almost too popular.
Yes.
And so was seen as kind of, by the time Whistler takes it up, that's what's sort of perverse about it, is that it was seen as a kind of middle brow taste, almost. And so he embraces it just at the moment when, every middle-class parlor might have a portfolio of watercolors that they would show you after dinner. And he takes some of those perceived middle brow qualities and elevates them, scale and accessible subject matter and so forth, and decorativeness, and makes those into aesthetic virtues and values.
This might be more of a philosophical question, but what I loved about the Venice harbor scenes is that he's experimenting with pastels, etchings, and watercolor as kind of a multimedia way to reinvent himself as an artist. And I'm just wondering, what about this period of the sketch and elevating the sketch is relevant today for a 21st century young artist that enjoys working in this kind of, all his favorite artists are within this romantic period. What does it all mean for today? Maybe that's
In terms of, when you say what does it all mean for today, in terms of the museum world, or in terms of galleries, or in terms of personal sort of artistic practice?
where we're headed with
Where we're headed with
painting
water.
and image making, and with basically the fact that everyone has these in their hands. I don't know. Maybe that's too philosophical, but where do you see watercolor headed? Maybe.
Yeah. That's a great question. And actually one I think about all the time, because I think there's a big divide between what's happening in the New York art world and what's happening in watercolor communities as far as what's being done. And certainly when you have technologies and things being created on iPads and stuff, that's very different than being on plein air in front of the subjects doing that. But I think that this impulse for people to do that, to be out in nature, to be observing and to be translating it, I think it's always been there and it's not going to fade. And perhaps, my personal philosophical perspective is that it's even more important nowadays to find ways to be connected with nature. And when you're translating it, when you're out there and you're actually doing these plein air sketches, there's a real connection to what you're seeing that you can't get through going around with your iPad taking pictures and posting them, right? So, and it's a real slowing down. When you looked at the Pre-Raphaelite show at the National Gallery, and these artists sat there for months doing this tiny image, we don't have the capacity or patience anymore, I think, to do that kind of slowing down and looking at what we're seeing. So, no, he did not. Exactly. So I don't know philosophically, as far as, certainly, like Tom Fairs is an example of someone who did these little tiny drawings in England and has been recently discovered by New York galleries, and everybody's going, ooh, look at these wonderful things. So we can hope that maybe some of these practices, I think there's still practitioners going on, small scale, observing nature. To what point are they part of the gallery, ending up in galleries and museum exhibitions, and when and if that's going to happen? That maybe you have some thoughts on.
No, I think you're right. I think that in a weird way, the kind of mediated, image-saturated world that we live in gives people a kind of hunger for the real and slowing things down and actually concentrating their attention on motifs, a practice of making, whether it's in nature in a studio or as an observer, a viewer in the museum.
A good place to end. We're going to be putting Peter's 2 demos here on the front of the stage, along with a couple other demos he made in preparation for this demo. And with his permission, maybe the paintbrushes. Sure. You can't take them, but we'll let you look at them. So.
And thank you so much. This was
seriously,
just a wonderful program.